I can see that starting any event in Mumbai at 9 a.m. is a bit of a challenge, but I congratulate those of you who are able to make it in time. And thank you for that generous introduction. I realize that it's not surprising that at an event like this, the introducer has looked me up on the internet, because very clearly that's the way we go these days. And I must say that I was relieved that there was nothing there that I hadn't actually said or done, because that happens a lot these days when you're introduced from material on the internet. Actually, I had a friend in New York who was even worse, who would look people up not just by what they had themselves accomplished, but by deeds and misdeeds up the family tree, the actions of uncles and aunts and grandparents. And at one point he found, amongst various sins of commission and omission, that he was about to introduce a speaker whose uncle had been electrocuted at Sing Sing prison for kidnapping and armed robbery or something equally horrible. But having taken the trouble to look this up, he felt he had to use it. So he said, our distinguished speaker had an uncle who occupied the chair of applied electricity at one of the nation's leading institutions. Just by way of saying that these kind and generous words should be taken with a pinch of salt. I can't tell you that I will answer all the questions that she suggested in her introduction, but I will try and deal with some of them, and I believe we have an opportunity to exchange views during a Q&A period immediately after. It is in many ways a reflection of our times that I am addressing you in the midst of a raging controversy in India over social media, with the government having reputedly accorded sanction for legal action against a number of social networking sites. I'll come back to that later. But in fact, freedom of expression is central to my appearance before you all today. As the Clico Asia organizers put it when they invited me to address this gathering, as a writer and an MP, they said, "You believe in free speech, right?" I said, "Sure, I believe in free speech." "Great," they said, "we'd like you to give one." So here I am to speak to you all freely on the reach and impact of social media in today's communications environment. And as I had said to the organizers, I'll take the global perspective as well as narrow it down to India in the second half of my address. And since any attempt to be comprehensive would make for a tedious and overly long address, my focus today will specifically be to look at social media's impact on world and national affairs. In fact, I found myself discussing this very issue a few months ago at a dialogue in Kolkata amidst the election campaign there for the State Assembly, which unseated the Communist Party of India, Marxist, after 34 years of continuous rule there. It's interesting that during an electoral effort aimed at unseating a 19th century ideology from power after more than 3 decades, we were discussing such a 21st century subject as the impact of social media and politics. And the victor, the new chief minister she became of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, went out of her way to stress that she is getting on the internet herself and learning to master the use of Twitter and Facebook. These, she said, were essential tools for tomorrow's political leaders. I haven't yet seen her Twitter account. I'm hoping it's coming very soon. But this is a promise I'm going to keep reminding her staff she made during the elections there. Now, this is all the more striking because I once asked a distinguished senior politician what he thought about the emergence of all these social media tools. Wouldn't they help getting our message across, I asked? Why weren't they more widely used? Was it ignorance or was it apathy? And he replied, "I don't know and I don't care," which rather sums up the problem. Now, before I return to domestic politics, I said I'd like to start with a global perspective. And in 2011, the role of social media websites, such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Skype, in the unfolding revolutions last year, in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, with ripples elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East, it certainly gave a new impetus to the discussion of social media on world politics. The eminent American journal, Foreign Affairs, debated the issue last year, and one analyst, Clay Shirky, argued eloquently that these tools, and I'm quoting here, alter the dynamics of the public sphere. Where the state prevails, it is only reacting to citizens' ability to be more publicly vocal and to coordinate more rapidly and on a larger scale than before these tools existed, unquote. On the other hand, author Malcolm Gladwell responded that for Shirky's argument to be anything close to persuasive, he has to convince his readers, said Gladwell, that in the absence of social media, those uprisings would not have been possible. And of course, such an argument is impossible to make. Now, my own position is actually somewhere in between. I believe that uprisings can occur and have occurred without Twitter or even Google, but media always has an impact on the reach and spread of word about an uprising, and therefore has an impact on its intensity and sustainability. In this case, I would argue that satellite television, notably Al Jazeera and its imitators, as well as mobile phones and SMSs, had probably more of an impact on the unrest across these North African Arab countries than Facebook or Twitter. But the impact is undeniable. As the American commentator Peter Osnos put it, and I quote, "It's pointless to dispute that digital advances have played an enormous role in recent years in the speed of communications, and in some instances, Egypt and Tunisia amongst them, these technologies have played a meaningful part in the rallying of crowds and in garnering international recognition." And I continue the quote from Osnos, "A global generation of mainly young people will continue to refine and use the capacity to reach out to each other. Turmoil reflects the conditions of the era in which it occurs, and social media very much a factor of our age," unquote. This is why, for example, China has paid so much attention to censoring the internet, employing 40,000 cyber police to monitor blogging sites, shutting down any sites that get out of line, and banning Twitter. When a US-based Chinese language site called for a Jasmine revolution in China, the Great Firewall of China blocked all searches for the word jasmine, even if you were merely looking for jasmine tea. Clearly, the authoritarians in Beijing are quite aware of the enormous potential of social media to disrupt even their politics. The reach of social media has been facilitated by rapid technological developments as well. When we speak of social media, we do not mean only media running on a desktop computer or a mainframe server. In a recent study, my good friend Nick Gowing of the BBC highlighted how in a moment of major unexpected crisis, and he's a news reporter, the institutions of power, whether political, governmental, military, or even corporate, face a new acute vulnerability of both their influence and their effectiveness thanks to new media technologies. In the 21st century, it's impossible to ignore the issue of the uncontrolled impact of instant news on the workings of society, and more generally on the impact of new media technologies on political affairs. As Gowing points out, it was a chance video taken by a New York investment banker that dramatically swung public perceptions of the police handling of the G20 protests a couple of years ago. And just 41 seconds of video uploaded on the internet swiftly exposed apparently incomplete police explanations of how and why a particular protester died, and they forced a level of instant accountability from the police about their orders, their behavior, and their operation. When American-led NATO warplanes last year bombed villages in Afghanistan's Azizabad village, US forces initially claimed only 7 people died. NGO said the bombing killed up to 90. Only after mobile phone videos emerged on the internet 2 weeks later did US commanders accept that they had to re-examine evidence. In a reinvestigation, the US armed forces had to revise the death toll upwards to 55. As Gowing argues, and I quote, "Such examples confirm how new information technologies and dynamics are together driving a wave of democratization and accountability. It shifts and redefines the nature of power in such moments. It also creates a new policy vulnerability and brittleness for institutions who then struggle ever harder to maintain public confidence," unquote. Now, globally, it's true that most major institutions of power still do not appreciate the full scale and implications of the dramatic new real-time media and the impact of this trend on the credibility of institutions of power. Increasingly, a cheap camera or a mobile phone that is easily portable in a pocket can undermine the credibility of a government, despite the latter's massive human and financial resources. The new lightweight technologies available to almost anyone mean that they enjoy a new capacity for instant scrutiny and accountability that is way beyond the narrow assumed power and influence of the traditional media. The world is full of examples of what Gowing calls non-professional information doers. That's hundreds of millions of amateurs, people like you and me, with an electronic eye who can now be found anywhere. As many as 4 billion people worldwide, including 84% of Americans, more than 60% of Chinese, and perhaps a little over 50% of all Indians today, now use mobile phones. So 4 billion worldwide. They all get messages out, and they do so more rapidly than the official mechanisms can. Their strength is that they enable people to issue and disseminate material, including raw footage and compellingly authentic images, before the mainstream media, or for that matter, governments, can do so. Inevitably, this means they shed light where officialdom would prefer darkness, as China learned when video footage of a shootout involving Uyghur separatists in 2008 made it to the world media despite Beijing's denials. Now, the key implications of this are striking. We've all heard about the so-called 24/7 news and information cycle. But with social media, the pressure of the news cycle can build up not just over 24/7 over a few hours, but literally in a few minutes. As images, facts, and allegations emanating from cell phones and digital cameras go viral, they undermine and discredit official versions, present an alternative reality in the face of government denials, and, fueled by dissenters and expatriates, rebound onto the evolution of the situation itself. Twitter and digital cameras had a huge impact on the Iranian protests after the disputed re-election of President Mohammad Ahmadinejad. Despite Tehran's attempts to manage the crisis, social media kept the protests alive for much longer and with far more prolonged intensity than they could have survived without the digital fuel, because you can ban newspapers, you can control television in Iran, but they could not fully or easily control digital media. Now, with such instant scrutiny, government power is rendered more vulnerable. In the old days, governments always assumed they could command the information high ground in a crisis. This is simply no longer true. Of course, there can be a more positive and non-confrontational use of social media in a crisis. I don't want to link this purely to political crises affecting governments, because when we had the catastrophe last year of the tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear accident in Japan, within days of the Japanese earthquake, 64% of blog links, 32% of new Twitter news links, and the top 20 YouTube videos all carried news and information about the crisis in Japan. 9 days after Japan's catastrophic earthquake, 2 urgent pleas for help appeared on the Twitter stream of the US ambassador, John Roos, asking for the urgent need to transfer hospitals from a nuclear radiation affected area, from a hospital, by air transport to another area. So the US ambassador saw these tweets on his mobile phone, obviously reaching him instantly, as Twitter does. So a year earlier, before he'd opened his Twitter account, getting the US ambassador's attention in such a direct and immediate way on any issue would not have been possible. So the ambassador activated the US military in response to the tweets. They in turn contacted the Japanese self-defense forces, and the patients were transported to safety. In other words, this time, troops were mobilized by Twitter. Japan's disaster has spotlighted the critical role, going well beyond the politics we've already talked about, that social media websites such as Twitter are increasingly playing in responses to crises around the world. They may have been designed largely for online socializing or just having fun, but such sites and others have empowered people caught up in crises. Their strength is that they enable people to share vivid, real-time, unfiltered images and text reports before any other source, including governments and traditional media, can do so. There's no doubting, as I've said repeatedly already this morning, the potential of social media to create information, whether video or text, and communicate it immediately without the delays necessarily wrought by editorial controls, cross-checking, or even the synthesizing that occurs in a humanitarian operations situation room. In Japan, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, UN body, took to YouTube to get its messages out. In the week following the earthquake and the tsunami, people viewed more than 40 million disaster-related items on the internet. The US Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, has become a huge proponent of social media in humanitarian emergencies. Its director, William Craig Fugate, has acknowledged that while no one invented Twitter to be an emergency messaging or disaster tool, volunteers using social media sites have played pivotal roles in various crises, from the BP Horizon oil spill, to the unrest in the Middle East, which we've already discussed, to the earthquakes in Haiti, Chile, New Zealand, and Japan. There were 70 million tweets on the Haiti earthquake alone. I went to Haiti myself, so I probably generated a handful of those too myself. But social media actually proved indispensable in providing information to draw crisis response maps and dispense assistance. So within an hour of the Japanese earthquake, for example, Google, which had already launched a disaster team in Haiti, and therefore they had a crisis response team, posted a person finder website that quickly grew to include 450,000 records. So let's say you're looking for someone after a disaster like an earthquake, you can post on Person Finder, my cousin is a teacher in such and such place, we're looking for him, and someone else may post, I've seen this person in a shelter, he's fine, and you can coordinate that on the site. So it's part of the insight, which governments are always slow to learn, that the public is not a liability, but a resource when it comes to information. What makes social media so different from other emergency response tools is that it allows a two-way conversation every time in the impact zone so that people in a crisis can be linked immediately with information, resources, and ideas. And in fact, Google's engineers also developed a software program that enables people to take snapshots of the lists of names posted on the walls of Japanese homeless shelters after the earthquake and scan them into their Person Finder program. So the photographs are regular photographs, but once they're scanned, you basically get thousands of names in a searchable database. And instead of names scattered through various missing persons databases, you've got that, and YouTube has even created a video Person Finder. So with more people than ever accessing videos on mobile phones, about 200 million people currently, it's estimated, watch videos on their mobile phones. That's triple the number of the previous year, and it may have gone up since I read this figure on the internet. So there's a constant, and once a country like India brings onto the typical mobile phone the technology to do that, you will find an exponential increase in the reach of such technologies. So social media, in other words, is going to be inescapable in all future international crises and disasters. On any given day, people are sending an estimated 140 million Twitter messages, nearly 1 billion tweets every week. There are two ways to look at this: that it's symptomatic of information overload, sometimes we all feel that, or that it represents a huge audience of information generators and information consumers that people in positions of public responsibility ignore at their peril. My own sympathies, as was mentioned in the introduction, are very much towards the latter view. Now, turning to India, as I promised, the case for social media has been gaining ground. We're already one of the world's leading countries in the use of Twitter, and social media is bound to gain as the prospects for e-government improve by the day. Though the Department of Information Technology's new rules on internet intermediaries have created a bit of a firestorm in cyberspace, in parallel, the first draft of the Electronic Delivery of Services Bill 2011, which hasn't been adopted yet, but which is before Parliament, has proposed that all ministries and government departments will have to deliver services electronically, whether through the internet or mobile phones. So in my view, India is not just on the right track, but bids fair to become a model of e-governance in the developing world. And yet the recent controversy over the government's alleged desire to censor Facebook, Twitter, and other leading lights of the social media has obscured our progress in this area and also raised some genuine and urgent questions we need to address about free speech in our society. The problem arose when the New York Times reported that our telecoms minister, Kapil Sibal, had called in senior social media executives from Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo, and allegedly asked them to pre-screen user content from India and to remove it before it goes online. Now, such a request inevitably sparked off a huge amount of internet protest against the minister without waiting to hear his side of the story. Facebook pages sprang up to denounce him. Web boards overflowed with nasty comments against the minister, my party, the ruling party, and the government, suggesting that they were actually trying to protect a political leader. And the hashtag on Twitter, you know these hashtags, tag hash idiots Kapil Sibal, started trending, all a bit over the top in my view. Now, as a frequent recipient of disparaging, inflammatory, or defamatory content myself, about myself, I'm no great fan of unpleasantness on any media, social or otherwise. But of course, I'm strongly opposed to censorship. Freedom of speech is fundamental to any democracy. And many of the most valuable developments in India would not have been possible without it. Freedom of speech is the mortar that binds the bricks of our democracy together, and it's also the open window embedded in those bricks. Free speech keeps our democracy accountable and helps political leaders know what people are thinking. Censorship is a disservice, therefore, to both the rulers and the ruled. But, and free speech advocates hate the but, which is why I began with the joke with which I began this morning, every society recognizes some sensible restraints on how free speech is exercised. Those restraints almost always relate to the collectivity. They arise when the freedom of the individual to say what he wants causes more harm to more people in society than restricting his freedom would. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the US put it memorably when he said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. After all, that would cause a stampede in which people could get trampled upon, injured, or even killed. The theater's property would be destroyed, all consequences that outweigh the individual's right to say what he likes. Now, since societies vary in their cultural and political traditions, the boundaries vary from place to place. Free speech absolutists tend to say that freedom is a universal right that must not be abridged in the name of culture. But in practice, such abridgment often takes place, if not by law, then by convention. No American editor, for example, would allow the N-word to be used to describe black Americans, not because it's against the law, but because it would cause such offense as to be unacceptable to use. Just as the commonplace practice of women taking off their bikini tops at Saint-Tropez, Copacabana, or Bondi Beach could not be replicated on the beaches of Goa, Dubai, or Karachi without risking assault or arrest, so also things might be said in the former set of places that would not pass muster in the latter. It's no use pretending that such differences of culture, politics, and sensitivity don't exist. They do, and they're the reason why free speech is to some degree, and I always stress a very limited degree, culturally sensitive. That free speech in Sweden isn't the same as free speech in Surat. Now, the problem is particularly acute on social media because it is a public forum for the expression of private thoughts. The fact is that social media's biggest asset is also its biggest problem. Its strength is, as I've said earlier, that social media enables ordinary people, not just trained journalists, but people like you and me, to share vivid, real-time, unfiltered images before anybody else can do so and to unleash them throughout the world. Even more, any individual with the basic literacy needed to operate a keyboard can express his or her opinion, create information, communicate it, and there can be, as I've mentioned earlier, no room for editorial controls, fact-checking, and so on. Now, this, of course, gives social media an advantage over regular media as a disseminator of public opinion. If you wanted to express your views in a newspaper, for example, you would have to write something well enough to pass editorial muster. Your facts and opinions would be checked, vetted, and challenged. Your prose might be cut for space reasons or even mere editorial whim, and you might have to wait days, if not weeks, to see your words in print. None of that applies to social media. You can write all you want, as you want, and the words you want on a blog or a Facebook page, put it up with a Twitter link, click a mouse, and instantly watch it all go viral. It's a 21st century freedom that no democratic political leader would wish to confront. And yet this very freedom is its own biggest threat. It means anyone can say literally anything, and inevitably many do. Lies, distortions, and calumny go into cyberspace unchallenged. Hatred, pornography, and slander are routinely aired. There is no fact-checking, no institutional reputation for reliability to defend. The anonymity permitted by social media encourages even more irresponsibility. People hidden behind pseudonyms feel free to hurl abuses that they would never dare to utter to their recipients' faces. The borderline between legitimate creative expression and disparaging, inflammatory, or defamatory content becomes more difficult to draw. Now, Minister Kapil Sibal's main concern, as he assured me when I called him on this, was not with politics, but with scurrilous material about certain religions that in India could have incited retaliatory violence by their adherents. People say or depict things on social media that might be bad enough in their living rooms, but that can be positively dangerous in a public space. The challenge of dealing with social media in a regulatory system is that the person writing or drawing such things does so in the privacy of his home, but releases them into the global commons. Now, my own yardstick is very clear. I reject censorship. Art, literature, and political opinion are to me sacrosanct. But publishing or circulating inflammatory material to incite communal feelings is akin in our environment, in our society, in our culture, to dropping a lighted match at a petrol pump. No society can afford to tolerate it, and no responsible government of India would allow it. Personally, I'd rather stub out that match than close down the petrol pump. But I do believe the standard should err on the side of extreme generosity towards those who are private citizens writing their views on the net. And in any case, I'm far from sure that prosecuting Facebook or Google is the right way to go, as one hears from the newspapers in the last couple of days. After all, could you sue the phone companies for someone sending a defamatory or obscene SMS? The analogy to a newspaper is wrong. That's the analogy that's often used, that if you can ban a newspaper for example, publishing hate speech or attacks on a religious community or whatever, why can't you ban a site like Facebook or Google? And the answer is that whereas a newspaper is a publication itself and the newspaper is responsible for all the content that appears on it, network sites are more like the postman who carries that newspaper to your door. You would prosecute the newspaper for publishing illegally actionable material, but you would not prosecute the postal service. Similarly, you can prosecute the person who puts up a hate speech or criminal or obscene or defamatory posting on his or her site, but you cannot, it seems to me, prosecute all of Facebook or all of Google for it. Our learned judges are now examining the matter, but I hope they will take into account these realities of the internet era. Now, that said, let me affirm how useful social media is in our society. It is already being employed to create knowledge networks, disseminate information, and keep track of the world around you well beyond what's available in our daily newspapers. A young Indian blogger, Mahima Kaul, wrote, and I'm quoting her, "Personally, Twitter is a better source of news than any newspaper homepage can hope to be, and Facebook keeps me abreast of my friends in a way that email or simple phone calls could not do. But that's not the point right now. In the context of social media, it allows strangers to connect over a decidedly neutral platform and talk about issues. Sure, people get nasty, but there is a distance of a computer screen or a mobile to save you from any unnecessary FaceTime," unquote. And that's clearly a blogger, I guess, in her 20s, and I can see fully where she's coming from. Now, I suppose I was the first government official in India who engaged with the general public online on Twitter, though in all fairness, L.K. Advani's webpage had already created a lot of buzz during the last elections. More and more politicians are online today, including Sushma Swaraj and Narendra Modi of the BJP, and Digvijay Singh, Anil Shastri, Naveen Jindal, Manish Tiwari, and Hamdullah Saeed of the Congress, with politicians issuing their own bulletins and actually answering individual questions online. Sometimes this creates its own challenges. Sushma Swaraj, as leader of the opposition in the lower house, has even once blamed Twitter's 140-character limit for an imprecisely worded message about the Prime Minister that created political ripples within her own party. Of course, there is the safety net that politicians can always type, delete, and retype before pressing enter. But Ms. Swaraj reportedly dictates her Twitter messages, so perhaps that is more difficult for her. Now, Indian bureaucrats have been following suit. The best-known example was probably former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao. She, in turn, may have been inspired by the success of the Ministry of External Affairs Public Diplomacy Division, whose officials, with my active encouragement, have set up a Twitter page and have been pursuing social media strategies, including a Facebook page and a YouTube channel, to let people know what the ministry and India's diplomatic missions do. This has enabled them to promote India's soft power, even within the country, by creating goodwill amongst social media users in general, whether in India or abroad. To me, the MEA's initiative was excellent. It puts India on a par with the Western democracies, which have already adopted social media sites as an instrument of outreach. Of course, you have to examine the advantages and possible pitfalls of using social media as a tool for diplomacy. The advantages are clear. India acquires a new, young, literate and global audience for our foreign policy initiatives and positions. By being accessible to internet searchers, we earn goodwill. By providing accurate and timely information, we eliminate the risks of misrepresentation or distortion of our position. And so social media is, in my view, a vital instrument already of our public diplomacy, which is a way of reaching the public and not just governments. And it's not just a way of putting out propaganda, it's also about listening. Because if you want to be on an interactive medium, you actually have to not only recognize that the public is entitled to be informed about what you're doing, but is entitled to responses from you and people in authority about their concerns. So successful public diplomacy will have to involve an active two-way engagement with the public, and you've got to do it in a sustained way so you can build up a reputation and a relationship of trust and credibility. And frankly, one of the strengths of all of this is you have multiple views. You don't just have one official line and you embrace them all as part of your messaging. Because after all, in our information-saturated world of today, the public around the world also has access to information and insights from a wide and rapidly growing array of sources. This means that government information has to be presented attractively and issued in a timely fashion if it's going to stand up against competing streams of information, including from foreign countries, from critics, and from rivals of your government. Your public diplomacy is no longer conducted in a vacuum. You're up against the public diplomacy of other countries, sometimes on the very same issues. Now, I know that diplomacy is not the principal preoccupation of people here, so I'm not going into too much detail, but it's striking that even the terrorist organizations, some of the jihadi organizations, have harnessed the full power of Web 2.0, I beg your pardon, to propagate their message. And that's something which is a clear message to governments around the world, that if the terrorists are doing it, you better be one step ahead of them with the resources you have. Now, there are pitfalls, and we should acknowledge them. One pitfall, obviously, is the ever-present risk of something said on a social network that itself could be taken out of context and misused. I'm kind of exhibit A for that myself. But there was another example recently when well-wishers on Twitter urged Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister Omar Abdullah to delete a light-hearted remark that could have been maliciously distorted by his political enemies. And he promptly did so, with the curious result that the advice to delete can still be found on Twitter, but the potentially offending remark itself has disappeared. Responses to questions, again, are particularly vulnerable to being issued in haste and without the usual vetting that more formal statements undergo. At the same time, the nature of social media calls for speedy issuance of information and instant reaction, neither of which government processes are designed for. In fact, it was pointed out at one point that after the Bombay blasts last July in Jaberi Bazaar, that the government of Pakistan issued a statement expressing concern and solidarity before any Indian government agency had yet had a chance to issue a statement about those blasts in our own country. Now, this is striking. At the same time, government agencies have begun effectively using social media. I mentioned the MEA. The Delhi police has a Facebook page. India Post is now helping people track parcels through Twitter. The Municipal Corporation of Delhi and the Pune City Council are providing information on garbage disposal. The census authorities have an extensive internet presence. And there is therefore, I think, an increasing sense that you can use social media not only to provide useful public information, but also add to the sense of public accountability. But the clear message, and I'm quoting again the young blogger I cited once already, Mahima Kaul, is that the Indian government has to learn to trust its people as well as trust its own ability to respond to its people. And that is something that we're going to have to really grow up with in the years to come. Now, as you know, my own experience with Twitter has had its positives and negatives. I would argue that the positives outweigh the negatives. because it's such an extraordinary interactive broadcast medium, an interactive Akashvani, I once called it, because with one message today, I can reach 1.2 million people, as was mentioned. The number keeps growing every day. Of course, it also falls once in a while when people decide they can't stand any more of what I have to say and they unfollow me. But nonetheless, there is material that compensates in many ways for the deficiency of traditional media. So when I was in government, I used it to put out information that the mainstream media wasn't interested in. So when, as a Minister of State for External Affairs, I went to Liberia, the first ministerial visit by India to that country in 38 years, it was completely ignored. Who in the Indian newspapers wants to write about Africa? The fact is that, by doing this, I was able to get India's Africa diplomacy much more widely known. In another example, a girl from my constituency who was amputated in both legs after a railway accident got offers of help from across the world because I tweeted about her and her family's predicament. So the use of social media to actually demystify the processes of governance and sensitize people to the life and preoccupations of politicians was why I began this process, and I'm so glad to see so many others following me. And that includes a bunch of foreign ministers. The Bahraini foreign minister, Khalid al-Khalifa, for example, did so only because I was doing so, and now he's a regular and inveterate tweeter. And of course, there are many others who, from other countries who've been tweeting quite independently. The former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, Canada's Leader of the Opposition, my friend, the Norwegian Foreign Minister, and so on. I won't go into too many examples. In India, there was initially a lot of resistance. Some of you may remember the BJP's Venkaiah Naidu presciently warning me too much tweeting can lead to quitting. And he turned out, in my case, to be right. But the fact is that Twitter has gone beyond that image of being a silly term and an irresponsible medium for a politician to one where more and more politicians, particularly younger ones, are getting absolutely convinced that in a 21st century democracy, you will have to use these media if you want to be an effective and successful politician. Those who are ahead of the curve are very rarely appreciated. I want to stress, though, that social media is only a vehicle. The message is the issue, not the medium. I think that what I'm trying to do brings into my party's ambit a large number of people who would otherwise be indifferent to politics or to my party, but it's the message I give them that's important. And if that message is misunderstood, of course, it does a great deal of damage. But there are positive uses, and certainly the sort of collection of Pakistani followers I've been able to develop, some of whom I was able to meet on a visit to Pakistan a week, 10 days ago, is an indication of how you can actually build bridges across the borders of this world, because, of course, social media recognizes no borders. The ultimate clinching argument might come from the marketplace, in the dizzying valuations of social media sites, which go way beyond their earnings or dividends. Every week, one of the new social media firms seems to attract a sky-high valuation. Profitless Twitter is said to be worth $10 billion. This will certainly be dwarfed when Facebook, the poster child of social media, goes public, perhaps this year. At its current stock market price, Facebook's value is somewhere between that of Ford, $55 billion, and Visa credit cards at $63 billion. But that is still less than a third of Google's value. The mind boggles at where both will be in the years to come. In other words, social media is here to stay, and we in India need to live with it. Quite simply, we will not be able to live without it. Let's make the most of it. Thank you.